Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Sara Lubratt, and today we are going to be recapping a little bit of 2024, including all of the words I wrote. I definitely set out into 2024 with some goals that I didn't hit all of, but a year is a really long time and goals change throughout that time period. So I am incredibly proud of everything that I was able to accomplish. I also accomplished some things that I wasn't necessarily expecting to at the beginning of the year. So 2024 was overall an absolutely amazing year. It was the first full year that I've been with my writing group, because that started probably about a year and 4 months ago, and I think I only missed 2 sessions when I was in town, but I really relied a lot on my writing group to show up for myself and my writing, and the casual peer pressure of showing up for other people. Accountability would be a much better word there, but I loved that camaraderie around writing. I also felt like I was able to prioritize meeting other writers more and starting to foster relationships with other creative people. I was able to hike over 200 miles this year, and as I'm filming this video right now, today is December 26th. I believe I hit my hiking goal for the year about 3 days ago. And when I say hiking goal, I mean that I realized I was probably at like close to 180 miles and realized how close I was to 200 miles that I decided to push myself to that 200 miles and had a great time doing so. I was also amazed at how many different hikes I did this year, because normally I have a couple favorites and I'll just do those over and over, but I feel like this year I probably only repeated 2 or 3 trails a couple times, and I tried a lot of new trails that I hadn't ever hiked before. I believe I went on 3 camping trips this year. I got to swim in a mountain lake for the first time. I went out of my way to drive out into the mountains for 2 different meteor showers. I have a niece that turned 1 this year, and I was able to prioritize visiting her and the rest of my family so that I can watch her grow up. I got my first ever YouTube sponsorship this year, and then that was quickly followed by 2 others that probably won't be posted until 2025. I had some work changes recently because I'm a full-time freelancer and content creator, but I stopped doing freelancing on Fiverr, where I was helping people edit their manuscripts, and I stopped doing that and have pretty much completely switched over in my freelancing to doing social media management. And so now I'm not doing Fiverr anymore, or at least that's the plan. I paused my account because I wasn't quite brave enough to shut it down, and I have now fully switched over to being a freelance social media manager. Another cool work opportunity that popped up during 2024 was I got asked to judge a writing contest, and then I was also able to accomplish some writing goals that I've been wanting to accomplish and finish for so long. I finished draft 6 and draft 7 of my high fantasy project that I call Project DE. I started querying for that project because I see that project falling more into the traditional publishing route, but I want to be a hybrid author overall. So I'm open-minded to what happens to that project, but I'm still querying, still trying to figure that out. I struggled through writing a synopsis for my querying process, and then I was able to get some feedback from an agent about my first chapter and what they felt like was lacking from my first chapter, and then I got to edit that chapter to hopefully being more grabby on the first page or 2 instead of waiting until the last page of the first chapter to pull a reader fully into the story, because I believe that the end of my first chapter is really strong, and I just don't think the first 2 or 3 pages of my book were strong enough to get an agent to reading the end of the first chapter. I also got this dragon necklace as my little reward for finishing draft 6 of my book, and then in draft 7 I ended up cutting out 18,000 words from the story, just tightening up the prose, making it a little bit shorter, and book 1 of Project DE, because I believe it's going to be a trilogy, ended up being 108,000 words long, which was down from 120 something. So that was a pretty impressive feat. And then after finishing draft 7, there was a national park that I had wanted to go and visit for at least a year and a half. And so I decided to book myself an Airbnb as my little victory congratulations to myself, my little celebratory trip for finishing not only draft 7, but the entirety of DE book 1. And I visited Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, and that might be my new favorite national park. And that was such a fun celebratory trip. And then after I finished DE book 1, I told myself that I wanted to work on some palate cleanser novellas, because I had 2 novella ideas that I thought that I could get through pretty quickly so that I could kind of use them, as I've said, as a palate cleanser, because I spent 9 years working on DE book 1. I have a whole video talking about why book 1 of Project DE took so long, but the first draft took 4 years, and then I spent 4 to 5 years working on drafts 2 through 7 and 2 rounds of beta readers, and just really working on getting that book to how it looks in my head. But now that it's there, I'm hopeful that books 2 and 3 will be a lot easier for me to write, because I've already spent so much time with the characters and in the world and with the world building and the magic system that I'm really hopeful that books 2 and 3 will go a lot smoother than book 1. Book 1 is also the furthest I've ever taken a story I've written. Even though I've written 5 novels, I've never edited edited ones so much. I've basically written 3 other rough drafts of books that have not seen the editing process at all. And then the first book I ever wrote, I did revise a couple times, but never to a point where it like actually had a plot. But that was also the first book I wrote. I was starting to figure things out. And then with DE, that's where I figured out plotting and character arcs. And then of course, that's the story that I took through 7 drafts, which I hope to never do again. But anyways, after I finished DE book 1, I wanted to work on 2 palette cleanser novellas. One of them was a fast-paced fantasy story. It takes place over like 3 or 3.5 days, and I was able to finish that novella very quickly in the span of like 3 months. And that was such like a refreshing change of pace to not only start something but to finish something so quickly, and to have the idea be so quickly paced that the story just kind of felt like it just flowed out of me. I had not been able to draft something in a really long time because I had been so diligent with trying to finish DE. And then the other novella that I have started but chose to not finish right now, I'm sure I'll come back to it at some point in time, is my sci-fi romance novella. I think that this story will end up being somewhere between 30 and 40,000 words. I know how it ends and I know how it started, but I kind of don't know how to get from point A to point B. So I've decided to let myself off the hook because I was starting to get really excited about DE book 2, and I have started brainstorming for that story. And then in the last couple weeks, I actually joined a D&D campaign, which is my first time ever playing Dungeons & Dragons, but one of my friends was starting a campaign and asked me to play, and I'm very excited for that to continue into next year. So now that we've talked about what 2024 looked like as a whole, let's talk about how many words I wrote each month. We're also going to be talking about the time that I spent writing each month, because I track in both word count and time. Just because some days, even though you sit down at your computer for 2 hours, you might only write 100 or 200 words. So I like tracking in both metrics, because as great as word count is, I really like the emphasis on timing, because that's much more input based than it is output based. So you can sit down at your computer for 2 hours, and then even if you don't write anything and you just spent that time brainstorming or coming up with new ideas, you still put in that time even if you didn't get a word count to show for it. In January, I wrote a total of 36,159 words. And when I say wrote, I mean that part of that and like a big chunk of that was actually editing for draft 6 of Project DE. So for editing draft 6 of DE, that was 31,971 of those words. For completely rewriting or adding new words to draft 6 was 3,736 words. I wrote 153 words of just pure brainstorming for my sci-fi romance novella because I hadn't started working on that yet. I wrote a whopping 14 words for my sci-fi novel that I call Project CBH, and I wrote 285 words in Project Veil. And across those projects, I wrote a total of 20 hours and 25 minutes in January, for a total of 15 days of writing. I feel like now is also a good time to mention that I write in ebbs and flows, so it kind of feels like I will have a really good 2 weeks of writing where writing is coming super naturally. I'm being really good with sitting down and achieving my goals. And then I have 2 or 3 weeks where I'm much more up in the air. I might brainstorm a little bit, but I'm much worse at sitting down to actually write unless I'm showing up to writing group. And so it kind of seems like my writing comes in spurts of 4 days really consistently, a day or 2 off, a couple more days for that 2 week span, and then I'll go 2 or 3 weeks without writing very much. The month of February was a little bit lighter overall. I wrote for a total of 11 days and across 3 projects, which was DE Draft 6, editing and rewriting, my sci-fi romance, and my Veil project. For DE Draft 6 edits, I have 3,809 words written down, but then for my DE D6 rewriting, I have 4,161 words written down. I don't totally remember why I separated them out like that, but it is what it is. And then 192 words in my sci-fi romance project and 729 words in the Veil project, for a total of 8,891 words written or edited or rewritten in February, for a total of 9 hours and 55 minutes. March is my birthday month, and I was really pushing hard to finish draft 6 of Project DE before my birthday because I had a friend coming into town, so I was trying to finish that draft before we left town for a trip that we were taking together to celebrate my birthday and her getting into grad school. So as you can see from this image, I took the last couple of days of March off because I finished draft 6 2 minutes before she landed at the airport. So I did 27,755 words of edits for Project DE draft 6 and 4,590 words of rewriting or writing new words in that same draft. And then I also wrote 296 words in my Veil novella, which again was probably just brainstorming because I hadn't truly started working on the Veil novella quite yet, for a total of 32,000 4,641 words that I worked with in March, for a total of 16 days of writing and 18 hours and 10 minutes. So then because I finished DE Draft 6 in March, in April then I got to start DE Draft 7, which was the final draft of Project DE. And because I had been changing the ending in Draft 6, which that's a whole other story, in as short as I can possibly put it, after Draft 3 I sent my book out to beta readers. They gave me feedback on the ending of the book that I didn't know what to do with, so Drafts 4 and 5 were not complete editing drafts. I made it about halfway through the book each time, so then Draft 6 had quite a serious emphasis on the ending of the story, which was where a lot of that rewriting was coming in, and quite frankly a lot of the word cutting was coming in, because I spent Draft 6 streamlining the ending to finally apply the beta reader feedback that I hadn't known what to do with until that point. So because I had just added those words, I wanted to start Draft 7 with looking at the end of the story again, just so that I could read that and then read through the whole story to work on cutting out words. So the only thing that I worked on in April was Project DE. For the entirety of this month, I have 0 as my word count, but across 14 days, I spent 21 hours and 55 minutes on Project DE. The month of May might have been the most I spent writing this whole year. Again, I just wrote down zeros for every day in May, but I was working on editing in Draft 7, which was focusing on cutting down on my word count. I also spent a weekend of that editing by hand on a camping trip, which was super cool and felt like it really helped me reframe editing to the point that I continued printing out pages for a couple weeks after that. I also had a day, and I believe it was May 7th, that I sent Draft 7 out to beta readers again just to make sure that things were feeling consistent, that the newer ending was better, and to ask my beta readers if there was anything obvious that could help me cut down on my word count. And because I was a little bit freaked out that I had sent my book out to beta readers, I officially started working on Chapter 1 of my Veil project and wrote 473 words for that. I kind of wish that I had included my editing word count for DE Draft 7 just because that would add to my overall word count for the year, so I might be adding that back in later. But as far as my spreadsheet is concerned, I wrote down zeros for the majority of the month. Even though I spent a whopping 45 hours and 15 minutes just on DE this month, and then also 120 minutes on my Veil project and 20 minutes on my CBH project. But May included 23 days of writing, which just blows me away. In June, I wrote for a total of 11 days for 14 hours and 15 minutes on Project DE. This is still when I was focusing on editing and cutting out word count. In July, I was still working on Draft 7, but for some reason I wrote 299 words while the rest of the days were 0. Couldn't tell you why. And then supposedly I spent 3 days working on my Veil project for a total of 668 words. So across the 14 days that I worked on writing in July, I wrote for a total of 18 hours and 55 minutes. And on the day that I finished Draft 7 of Project DE were 5 hours and 35 minutes of that total time for the month. And then I celebrated by going and watching the sunset. For the month of August, my priority was figuring out how to write a synopsis, and I was struggling. I ended up writing 3,276 words for my Project DE synopsis. I also ended up working with an editor this month just for some feedback on that synopsis, trying to make it as good as I possibly could. And I wrote 3,300 words for my Veil project, resulting in 14 hours and 35 minutes across 11 days of August. In September, I was still working a lot on my synopsis. I was really struggling with the synopsis, if that isn't abundantly clear. When I first wrote my synopsis, it was twice as long as it was supposed to be, because I believe your synopsis is supposed to be between 700 to 1,000 words. I was shooting for 1,000, and I wrote over 2,000 the first time I tried to sit down and write it. So was really struggling with trying to get that word count down, which is a big part of the reason that I chose to work with an editor on my synopsis. And then I tried just rewriting it a couple times, and it was just a mess. I was not great at tracking my word count for this. I gave myself a lot of zeros for the days that I was working on my synopsis, but I did write down that I wrote 1,576 words one day and 425 words in my Veil project for a total of 16 hours and 10 minutes across 12 days of September. October is when I more officially started working on my fantasy palette cleanser, which was my Veil novella, and across 15 days in October, I wrote a total of 12,198 words. A little bit of that was in DE Book 2, which which was just brainstorming. 10,322 words of that was in my Veil project. 734 words of that was in my sci-fi romance project. Once again, a whopping 86 words was for my CBH project, for a total of 16 hours and 15 minutes across the 15 days that I wrote in October. Across the month of November, I wrote 11 days. 9,947 words of that were in my Veil project. I got to almost the end of Veil, and then I realized that I was like 2 paragraphs from the end, and I decided that I wanted to make myself go back through the story and work on bolstering it so that it looked closer to what I had in my head, which meant adding some character names because I'm really bad at naming my characters, adding some backstory for the main character, and adding in some relationships so that what happens in the story has a little bit more of an emotional pull. So that's what I was focusing on during the month of November with the Veil project. I also went on a writing retreat where I started working on my sci-fi romance novella, and I wrote 2,504 words for that, for a total of 14 hours across 11 days in November. And so far during the month of December, I have written 8 days, mostly focusing on my Veil project, for a total of 11,015 words in 8 hours and 45 minutes. So far this month, I still have 6 more days until the end of the year, but I'm with family right now for the holidays, so I don't know if I will actually write more. So now let's talk about the totals. I'm gonna go ahead and include my total word count for DE Draft 7. I still don't know why I left myself so many zeros during that span of time. I know I was just focusing on cutting out word count and the time that I was putting into editing, but for the sake of my totals of this year, I'm going to include that word count. So for the total of 2024, I wrote or edited or rewrote 231,172 words for a total of 212 hours and 20 minutes across 161 days, meaning that I wrote not quite half the days, but every time I sat down to write, I wrote an average of a little over an hour and 20 minutes. For 2025, I might choose to make a separate video for my goals, but I would love to write over half the days. I would love to write at least 30 hours a month, so an average of an hour a day, even though I know that I don't write every single day, so maybe like closer to an hour and a half to 2 hours every day I do choose to write. But I feel like I was able to get so much done during 2024, and I'm so excited about 2025. And every year I always try to set like really ambitious goals. So I'm kind of struggling with my goals this year because I know that things change, and I know that goals change, and I know that what's important to me can change, and like what projects I want to work on changes. So for the time being, that's what I'm thinking for 2025, but I might follow this up with a 2025 goals video. Let me know about some of your favorite things that you were able to accomplish, whether that's writing wise or just general life wins for 2024. I would love to read them. I want you to remember that progress is progress, and when you are reflecting on this year, remember that it might not seem like you came that far because you are constantly raising the bar. So please be proud of yourself. Remember that progress is progress, and I look forward to all of the words we're going to get to write next year. I'm Sara Lubratt. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.